Chapter 1. The Last Shift. The last thing Amber remembered was the crushing weight of a thought. If one more person said just one more thing, doctor, she might actually scream. Not a polite, professional scream. Not the kind of frustrated huff she let out in the break room when the vending machine swallowed her last dollar. No, this would be a primal, soul-shattering sound, a siren to match the ones that had been wailing outside the ER bay for the last 14 hours. But she didn't. She never did. Inside, her mind was a tempest, but outside, she was a statue of clinical efficiency. The hospital didn't just smell like antiseptic, it tasted like it. The air was thick with the cloying scent of bleach, scorched coffee that had been sitting in the pot since 4 a.m., and that underlying metallic tang of blood that no amount of industrial scrubbing could ever truly erase. It was a scent that clung to her skin, burrowed into her hair, and followed her home like a persistent ghost. The fluorescent lights overhead didn't just illuminate, they judged. They buzzed with a low-frequency hum that vibrated in Amber's very teeth, flattening the world into a two-dimensional plane of sterile white and dismal gray. Everyone beneath them looked like a wraith, gaunt, sallow, and drained of color. Amber stood at the central nurse's station, her fingers cramping as she clutched a heavy plastic clipboard to her chest like a shield. Her red hair, once of vibrant, defiant copper, was pulled into a knot that had surrendered to gravity hours ago. Stray, damp strands clung to the salt-slicked skin of her temples. 14 hours. Her feet weren't just sore. They felt like they had been pulverized into the linoleum. Her lower back throbbed with a rhythmic, pulsing ache that timed itself to the beat of her heart. Her hands, those steady, surgical hands, were raw from 50 washings. The skin cracked at the knuckles and stained with the faint, persistent scent of latex. They trembled, just a fraction, as she flipped the last page of a chart. "Doctor?" The voice was soft, hesitant. Amber turned automatically, her neck clicking with the effort. "Yes?" It was Sarah, a first-year nurse whose eyes were currently more dark circle than iris. She held a chart against her scrubs like a written apology for what she was about to ask. "Room 12, Mr. Harrison. He's asking for you again. He says the shadows in the corner are moving." Amber closed her eyes for a heartbeat, letting the darkness behind her lids offer a momentary sanctuary. Room 12. Mr. Harrison was 78, dying of a systemic failure that medicine could no longer outrun, and he was terrified of the dark. "I'll go," Amber said. She didn't say it because she had the energy. She said it because she was the only thing standing between that man and a lonely, terrifying end. Room 12 didn't smell like bleach. It smelled like the slow, heavy approach of the end, a mixture of stale sweat, unwashed skin, and the sharp, vinegar-scented breath of organ failure. It smelled like fear. Amber didn't check his vitals. She didn't adjust his IV. She simply pulled up a hard plastic chair and sat. She listened to him talk about a farm in Ohio that had been sold 30 years ago. She let him recount the way the corn looked in July, until his voice cracked into a dry wheeze. Then, she reached out and took his hand. His skin felt like ancient parchment, thin and translucent, but his grip was surprisingly desperate. "You'll be back?" he whispered, his eyes clouded with cataracts and terror. "I'll be back soon," she lied. It was a mercy. A soft blanket of a lie designed to get him through the next hour. When she finally pushed through the heavy double doors of the hospital exit, the night air hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was cool, damp, and blessedly real. No recycled oxygen, no scent of illness. She stood in the middle of the asphalt parking lot, her lungs expanding in a way that felt almost painful. She stared back at the glowing monolith of the hospital, its windows like 1,000 unblinking eyes. "I can't do this forever," she thought, the realization sinking into her bones like lead. "I am being erased by this place." The drive home was a fugue state. Amber's movements were purely mechanical. Shift into gear. Check the mirror. The world outside her window was a smear of neon signs and street lamps. Red lights bled into the wet pavement. Yellow lines strove to keep her centered. The hum of the tires on the asphalt was a lullaby her body was all too ready to accept. She felt her eyelids grow heavy, the grit behind them scratching like sand. She yawned, a deep, jaw-cracking stretch that forced her eyes to water. Then, the world tilted. High beams, blinding and celestial, exploded across her windshield, turning the interior of her sedan into a white-hot furnace of light. There was no time to brake, no time to pray. Too close, too fast. The world didn't just make a noise, it screamed. The sound of the impact was visceral, the shriek of grade, a steel buckling like tinfoil, the crystalline burst of safety glass shattering into 10,000 diamonds. Amber felt the sickening sensation of weightlessness, her stomach lurching into her throat as the car spun, a chaotic dance of kinetic energy and ruin. Then, the silence of the void. Darkness claimed her, thick and absolute. She woke to a sound that felt like it was peeling the skin from her soul. It wasn't a siren. It wasn't the rhythmic beep of a cardiac monitor. It was a high, shrill, undulating ululation, a scream that carried the weight of something ancient and hungry. It cut through the air like a serrated blade, vibrating in the marrow of her bones. Amber's eyes flew open. Her first breath was a jagged shard of ice cutting into her lungs. Sunlight, more aggressive than any hospital bulb, hammered against her retinas. She groaned, rolling onto her side, her fingers digging into something coarse and cold. Not linoleum, not carpet, grass, rough, waist-high stalks of a deep, emerald hue she had never seen in nature. She looked up, squinting through a haze of pain. The sky above was an impossible, vivid cerulean, a blue so deep it looked painted. There were no contrails from airplanes, no smog, no skyscrapers breaking the horizon. Just a vast, terrifying expanse of emptiness. Her head throbbed with a rhythmic, wet heat. Accident, her medical brain supplied, trying to anchor her. Concussion. Traumatic brain injury. I'm hallucinating. This is the brain's way of processing the trauma. Then the scent reached her. It wasn't the sanitized blood of the ER. This was thick, heavy, and hot. It was the smell of an open-air slaughterhouse, coppery and sweet, hanging in the stagnant air like a shroud. Amber pushed herself up, her muscles screaming in protest. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She wasn't in a parking lot. She was in a clearing, surrounded by a wall of trees whose bark looked like hammered silver, and the ground was carpeted in death. Bodies lay scattered like discarded dolls. These weren't people she recognized. They were men and women with skin the color of burnished bronze, dressed in tunics of rough-hewn fur and intricate, hand-tooled leather. They lay torn open, their internal geography laid bare to the sun. One man's chest had been caved in by a force that looked like it had used him for sport. Another lay at an angle that defied human anatomy, his glassy eyes staring up at the blue sky with a final, frozen expression of shock. "Oh my God," Amber whispered, her voice a dry rasp. This wasn't a crash site. There was no twisted metal, no smell of gasoline or burning rubber. This was a massacre. A roar thundered through the clearing, low and resonant, vibrating the very earth beneath her palms. Amber's blood turned to slush. She scanned the tree line, her survival instincts, buried under years of civilization, suddenly snapping to life. The movement was a blur of shadow and muscle. Something enormous erupted from the silver trees. It was a nightmare made flesh. The beast was the size of a grizzly, but built with the low, lethal grace of a panther. Its fur was matted, dark and damp with fresh viscera. When it opened its mouth, it revealed rows of curved, yellowed teeth, slick with gore. Its eyes weren't the mindless eyes of an animal. They were yellow, slit-pupiled, and filled with a terrifying, calculated intelligence. It wasn't a scavenger. It was a predator. And it was still hunting. Amber froze, her mind cataloging the threat with useless clinical detachedness. Carnivore. Weight, approximately 800 pounds. Speed, likely 40 miles per hour. Weapons, none. Outcome, fatal. She was going to die. Here, in the dirt, under a sun she didn't recognize. Then, a small, wet sound cut through her paralysis. A whimper. Amber spun her head toward the sound. A few yards away, partially obscured by the body of a fallen woman, lay a child. A boy, perhaps 6 or 7 years old. His leg was mangled, a deep, jagged furrow torn through the meat of his thigh. Amber saw the rhythmic, pulsing spray of bright red blood. Arterial nick. Femoral. The terror that had paralyzed her vanished, replaced by the cold, hard clarity of her training. The beast was forgotten. The strange sky was forgotten. There was a bleed, and she was a doctor. No, she breathed, her feet moving before she gave them permission. The beast lunged, a low growl vibrating in its throat. Amber didn't run away. She ran toward the boy. She dropped to her knees in the blood-soaked grass, her hands instantly slick and warm as she clamped them down on the boy's thigh. The pressure was immense, her knuckles turning white. "Stay with me," she commanded, her voice firm and low. "Look at me. Stay with me." The boy's skin, that beautiful deep bronze, was fading to the color of wet ash. He looked at her, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it eclipsed the pain. He didn't understand her language, but he understood the urgency in her touch. The beast skidded to a halt 10 feet away, its massive claws churning up the turf. It paced, head low, snapping its jaws. It was confused by this pale creature in blue scrubs that didn't smell like the others. Amber didn't look up. She couldn't. If she let go, the boy died in seconds. She reached out with one hand, grabbing the hem of a dead man's fur tunic. With a strength born of pure adrenaline, she ripped a long, thick strip of cloth. She fumbled with it, her hands sliding in the gore, but she managed to loop it around the boy's upper thigh. She found a discarded bone dagger nearby, tucked it into the knot, and twisted. A makeshift tourniquet. The boy let out a raw, soul-tearing scream as the pressure cut off the circulation. "I know," Amber whispered, tears finally blurring her vision. I know. Just breathe." The beast had seen enough. It let out a roar that felt like a physical weight and crouched to spring. Amber stood up. She didn't have a weapon. She didn't have a plan, but she was exhausted. She was grieving for a world she might never see again. And she was angry. "No!" The scream tore out of her throat, a jagged, guttural sound that echoed off the silver trees. It wasn't the scream of a victim. It was the roar of a woman who had spent 14 hours fighting death and wasn't ready to lose another patient. The beast flinched. It backpedaled, its ears flattening against its skull. It wasn't used to prey that screamed back. Suddenly, the forest erupted. Men burst from the shadows, a dozen of them, towering and fierce. They were armed with spears tipped in obsidian and heavy, double-bladed axes. Their faces were painted with streaks of gray ash and dried blood, their eyes burning with a wild, desperate light. They shouted words that were sharp and percussive, a language of stones and wind. The beast, realizing it was now outnumbered, let out one final frustrated snap of its jaws before melting back into the darkness of the woods. Silence crashed back down, heavier than the noise. Amber's legs finally betrayed her. The adrenaline evaporated, leaving her hollow and shaking. She sank to her knees next to the boy, her vision tunneling into a narrow, dark circle. The warriors surrounded her instantly. Their spears were leveled at her throat, the obsidian tips glinting in the harsh sunlight. They spoke to each other in low, urgent tones, their eyes darting from her strange blue clothes to her flaming red hair, and finally to the tourniquet on the boy's leg. Amber raised her hands slowly, palms out. They were stained dark to the elbows. "He's hurt," she said, her voice trembling. She pointed at the boy, then at the man she had taken the cloth from. "I helped him. He needs a real bandage. He needs help." Blank stares. One of the men, a giant with a beard braided with leather, stepped closer. He poked her shoulder with the butt of his spear, his expression one of profound suspicion and a touch of revulsion. A tall woman stepped forward from the back of the group. She had a long, jagged scar that ran from her temple to her jaw, and her dark hair was bound in a complex series of braids. She crouched beside the boy, her fingers hovering over the tourniquet. She looked at the way the bleeding had stopped, then looked up at Amber. Her eyes were cold, calculating. She spoke a single word, "Wit." The others took it up, a low, rhythmic chant that sounded like an accusation. "Wit. Wit." Amber's stomach dropped. She didn't need a translator to feel the weight of that word. It sounded like witch. It sounded like curse. It sounded like other. "I'm not," she started, but the woman stood and gave a sharp command. Two men lunged forward, grabbing Amber by the upper arms. Their grip was like iron, bruising the skin beneath her thin scrubs. "No!" she cried, struggling, her eyes fixed on the boy. "He needs to be carried carefully. The leg!" The world tilted again. The exhaustion, the blood loss from her own unseen injuries, and the sheer impossibility of the situation finally pulled her under. Darkness, merciful and cold, closed in once more. She dreamed of white hallways that never ended. She dreamed of the sound of a heart monitor flatlining, the long, continuous beep turning into the scream of the beast. She dreamed of hands, thousands of them, pulling at her hair, trying to drag her into the earth. She woke choking on the scent of wood smoke and roasted meat. Amber lay on a pallet of scratchy furs inside a circular hut. The walls were made of tightly packed earth and timber, the ceiling a dark mass of thatched straw. A small fire crackled in a central pit, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. She tried to sit up and immediately doubled over, as a wave of vertigo hit her. "Easy," a voice said. She froze. It wasn't English, but the tone was a command. A man stood in the shadows near the doorway. As he moved into the firelight, Amber felt her breath hitch. He was broad-shouldered and lean, his bronze skin mapped with the white lines of old scars. His hair was black as obsidian, tied back with a cord of dark leather. At his hip hung a sword that looked heavy enough to split a boulder. He spoke again, a long string of those guttural, sharp syllables. I don't understand," Amber croaked, her throat feeling like it had been scraped with sandpaper. "Where am I? What is this place?" The man's brow furrowed. He stepped closer, his shadow looming over her. He repeated his words, slower this time, his voice a deep rumble that she felt in her chest. Still nothing. The sounds were alien, lacking any Latin or Germanic roots she could cling to. Fear, cold and sharp, coiled in her gut. She was a woman of science, of communication, of charts and data. To be stripped of her language was to be stripped of her humanity. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. I just want to go home." The man studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He looked at her red hair, which seemed to glow like embers in the firelight, and then, at her pale, freckled skin. He looked at her as if she were a strange, potentially dangerous animal that had wandered into his camp. He turned toward the door and barked a command. A younger man appeared, his eyes sharp and mocking. He pointed at Amber and laughed, a short, harsh sound. "Wit," the first man said, gesturing toward her. The younger man spat on the dirt floor and replied with a sneer. Amber pulled the furs around her, feeling the cold seep in despite the fire. She understood then that she wasn't a guest. She wasn't a refugee. She was a curiosity, a tool, a prisoner. The village, she discovered over the following weeks, was a place of brutal, monochromatic survival. It was a cluster of low-slung huts protected by a massive wooden palisade of sharpened logs. The ground was a permanent slurry of mud, animal waste, and ash. The people were a tribe of shadows and bronze. They moved with a predatory grace, their lives dictated by the rising and setting of a sun that felt too close to the earth. They stared at her constantly. Women paused in their grinding of grain to watch her pass, their eyes filled with a mixture of awe and resentment. Children threw stones from behind the safety of their mothers' skirts. Her red hair was a beacon of otherness. In a world of earth tones, browns, tans, and deep greens, she was a splash of impossible color. She was the wit. They didn't treat her with kindness, but they didn't kill her. They learned quickly that her hands held a strange power. When a hunter returned with a festering wound, she used boiled water and sharp needles to stitch the skin. When a child burned with fever, she found willow bark near the stream and made a tea that broke the heat. "Wit," they would mutter when the hunter walked again. "Wit," they whispered when the child's eyes cleared. They used her, but they feared her. They spoke around her, their voices a constant, incomprehensible hum. Amber learned to read the tilt of a head, the set of a jaw, the narrowing of an eye. She learned the vocabulary of threat and the syntax of suspicion. At night she would lie on her furs and whisper the names of things from her old life, like a prayer. Stethoscope, penicillin, Starbucks, Interstate 95, Brooklyn. The words felt like they were dissolving, losing their meaning in the face of this raw, violent reality. She searched the perimeter of the village for a way back, a rift in the air, a familiar landmark, but she found only the endless, silver forest and the towering mountains that pierced the sky like broken teeth. 1 year. She marked the time by the cycles of the moon, scratching lines into the wooden post of her hut. She had survived a year of blood, of silence, and of the crushing weight of being alone in a crowd. Then, the horns sounded. It was a sound unlike the beast's scream. It was a sound of order, of metal, of an approaching storm. It was deep, sonorous, and filled with a terrifying confidence. The village exploded into chaos. Men grabbed their spears. Women gathered children and fled toward the back of the palisade. The air grew thick with the scent of wood smoke and panic. Amber stood in the center of the muddy track, her red hair wind-whipped and tangled. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, a rhythmic, heavy thudding of 1,000 hooves. She looked toward the gate, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Somewhere beyond the rising dust and the screams of her captors, a shadow was falling over the land. They whispered a new name now, a word that carried more weight than wit, the conqueror. And as the first black banners appeared on the horizon, Amber knew with a sudden, bone-deep certainty. Her long year of silence was over. Her life was about to be torn apart once again, but this time, she wouldn't be watching from the sidelines. The doctor was out. The survivor was all that remained. Chapter 2, The Witch Who Listened. The horns did not mean battle for Amber. Not in the way they meant battle for the men of the village, a clash of steel, a tally of glory. For her, the horns were a countdown. They meant the end of a fragile, year-long equilibrium, and the beginning of a terrifying new unknown. The villagers did not rush the palisade in a frenzy of panic. Instead, they moved with a grim, practiced efficiency, like a herd of deer that had caught the scent of a wolf. They were people for whom peace was the exception and war was the rule. Men with bronze skin and dark hair emerged from the communal longhouses. They pulled children from the open paths with a rough, wordless urgency, shoving them into the shadows of the sturdier huts. Women barred doors with heavy beams of silver wood, their eyes darting to the sky as if expecting the clouds to rain fire. Through the center of it all stood Amber, a ghost born of two worlds. Over the year, her scrubs, once a crisp, professional cerulean, had been patched and reinforced until they were a strange, tactile tapestry. She still wore the scrub pants, though the knees were now reinforced with dark, supple deerskin to prevent them from shredding against the rocky soil. Her V-neck top was hidden beneath a vest of shorn rabbit fur, laced up the sides with leather thongs. She had replaced her tattered sneakers with high, fur-lined boots that smelled of wood smoke and tallow. She was a doctor in a barbarian's skin, a creature of science draped in the spoils of a primitive wilderness. The tremor beneath her feet grew stronger, a rhythmic, bone-deep thrumming. Thud, 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 as if the earth itself were bracing for a titan's arrival. She turned to the nearest man, a broad-shouldered warrior named Tan, who was obsessively sharpening the edge of a massive obsidian axe. "Please," she said, her voice sounding thin and brittle against the rising din. "Tan, Santa. Look at me. What is happening?" He didn't look up. He didn't even pause, the rhythmic shick-shick of stone against glass. She tried again, louder this time, gesturing helplessly toward the wooden gate. "Who is coming? Who?" The language barrier was a physical wall. Her words were swallowed by the noise of preparation, the sharpening of steel, the low, panicked murmurs of the women, and the thundering hooves drawing closer. Suddenly, a hand clamped onto her arm with the force of a vice. Amber yelped, twisting instinctively, but the grip only tightened. She found herself nose to nose with Rye, the scarred woman who had first labeled her wit. Rye's face was a map of old battles, her dark eyes flashing with a mixture of irritation and genuine fear. Rye spoke sharply, her words percussive and fast. She pointed a calloused finger toward the hut at the far end of the village, the infirmary where Amber had spent her year. "I don't want to hide," Amber shouted, even though she knew it was a lie. Rye grabbed Amber's chin, forcing her to look straight into those dark, obsidian eyes. "Wit," Rye hissed. "Santa go." Santa. The word for stop, for stay, for obedience. Amber swallowed hard, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She nodded slowly. Rye released her with a shove, and Amber stumbled toward the hut. The heavy timber door slammed behind her, and the bar dropped into place with a definitive thud. The darkness inside pressed in immediately, thick and smelling of dried herbs and old blood. The sounds outside, the horns, the shouting, the horses, became muffled and distorted. She sank onto her pallet of furs, hugging her knees to her chest. The conqueror. She had heard the name whispered in the village like a curse. She didn't know then that this was the last moment of relative safety she would have for a very long time. The attack came at dusk. Amber knew because the thin slivers of light through the thatch shifted from a harsh, unforgiving gold to a bruised, melancholic purple. She knew because the screams changed. As a doctor, she had learned to categorize screams. There were screams of shock, screams of sudden agony, and screams of grief. But these were the screams of slaughter. They were high, thin, and cut off abruptly, leaving a jagged silence in their wake. The horns of the village were answered by others, deeper, more numerous, sounding like the lowing of massive metallic beasts. The wooden palisade groaned. There was a sickening, splintering crash, the sound of the gate surrendering, followed by the heavy, disciplined trample of boots on mud. Amber pressed her hands over her ears, rocking herself. "This is not my war. I am a ghost here." The door to the hut burst open. A man stumbled inside, his silhouette framed by the orange glow of a village now on fire. He was clutching his side, blood gushing between his fingers in dark, rhythmic pulses. He collapsed at Amber's feet, the air whistling in his throat like a broken flute. Amber screamed, a short, sharp sound, but her body didn't wait for her brain to catch up. She was across the room in a second. She didn't have her sterile gauze or her surgical clamps. She grabbed a handful of clean rabbit fur and pressed it into the wound, her weight leaning into the man's hip. "Don't move," she muttered in English, the habit too strong to break. "Santa, Santa," the man groaned, his eyes rolling back in his head, his bronze skin turning a sickly, translucent gray. More men followed. The hut, once her sanctuary, became a triage center of nightmares. They dragged themselves inside, leaving trails of crimson in the dirt, because even in the middle of a massacre, the legend of the wit who stopped the bleeding was the only hope they had. Amber worked until her shoulders burned and her hands were permanently stained. She boiled water over the small hearth, the steam mixing with the scent of copper and singed hair. She used bone needles and sinew to close gashes that would have required 20 stitches in the ER. Outside, the sounds shifted again. The chaotic clashing of blades faded into the rhythmic, terrifying sound of a city being occupied. When the door opened again, it wasn't a wounded villager. A man stood in the doorway, so tall he had to duck his head to enter. His armor wasn't the mismatched fur and leather of the villagers. It was dark, matte black plate. His bronze skin was splattered with blood. His eyes were not angry. They were cold. Analytical. He looked at Amber, at her red hair, her strange patched scrubs, and her blood-soaked hands. Then he looked at the men she had saved, lying in various states of unconsciousness around her. He spoke a single word, his voice a low, melodic baritone. "Wit?" Amber didn't flinch this time. She stood up, her legs shaking, her chest heaving. I am a doctor, she said, her voice hoarse from the smoke. I don't understand you, but these men need water. What? They need what? The soldier tilted his head. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and barked a command over his shoulder. 2 more soldiers entered. They didn't look at the wounded. They walked straight to Amber and seized her arms. No, wait, Amber protested, struggling as they hauled her toward the door. The man in the corner, the tourniquet. It needs to be loosened. Her words were white noise to them. She was dragged outside, her fur-lined boots skidding through the mud. The village she had known was gone. The central square was a pyre of burning grain and timber. Black banners, embossed with a silver hawk, fluttered from spears planted in the earth like tombstones. She was shoved forward toward a group of captives, women, children, and the elderly, who were being bound together with thick, abrasive rope. At the center of the carnage sat a man on a horse. The horse was a monstrous creature, black as a void. The man atop it wore armor that seemed to be made of night itself. His dark hair fell loose down his back, and his face was a mask of aristocratic indifference. He didn't need to speak. His presence was a gravity well, the conqueror. Amber looked at him, and for a fleeting second, his gaze drifted over the crowd and landed on her. For that one heartbeat, the world went silent. He didn't look at her like a prisoner. He looked at her like a map he was trying to read. Then, he looked away. Captivity was not a cell. It was a march. They were moved south, away from the silver forests and toward the jagged, sun-scorched mountains. Amber was tethered to a line of 15 other women. The rope chafed her wrists, rubbing the skin raw. She was housed in the camp of the followers, the seamstresses, and the conquered. To them, Amber was a freak. They stared at her pale, freckled skin and her flame-colored hair. Wit. She understood the word now. It wasn't just witch. It was a word that meant strange power. The first night in the camp, a young woman named Ina crawled over to Amber in the darkness. She was clutching her stomach, her face twisted in agony. Amber's first instinct was to pull away. If I help them, I am useful. If I am useful, I will never be free. But the doctor won. It always did. Amber spent the night massaging the woman's abdomen, using heat from the communal fire. By morning, Ina's fever had broken. The next day, Ina brought Amber a wooden bowl of water. She pointed at the liquid, her eyes soft with gratitude. What? Ina said. Amber repeated it, her tongue feeling heavy. What? Ina smiled, a small, fragile thing, and pointed to the hard gray bread in her other hand. Tor, Amber echoed. As the march continued, Amber's vocabulary grew out of necessity. Pain was the greatest teacher she had ever had. Her meant wound. Hot meant fever or fire. Santa meant stop. Ven meant come. She began to stitch together the grammar of their lives. She learned that they didn't have a word for hospital, but they had 5 different words for the way a person died. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, a soldier approached the followers' camp. He was limping, his leather greaves soaked with blood. He stopped directly in front of Amber. The camp went silent. He looked down at her, his expression a mix of shame and desperation. He pointed to his leg, then back toward the main pavilion. Wit, he said, his voice a gravelly plea. Her, Santa. Amber looked at his leg, then up at him. She didn't have her tools. She didn't have her medicine. But she had her knowledge. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her deerskin-patched pants. Then, she said, using their word for come, she led him toward the fire. As she worked, she felt the eyes of the entire camp on her. Not just the followers, but the guards at the perimeter. She realized then that she was no longer just a prisoner. She was becoming a resource. As she finished the soldier's bandage, she looked up and saw a figure standing on the ridge above the camp. He was silhouetted against the rising moon, his dark cape catching the wind like wings. The hawk was watching. Amber gripped her bone needle until the point bit into her thumb, drawing a single drop of blood. She didn't look away. I am Amber, she whispered to herself in English. I am Amber, and I am still here. Chapter 3. The Witch They Needed. Amber did not remember the exact moment the camp stopped seeing her as a fleeting curiosity and began seeing her as a grim necessity. It happened quietly, the way rot spreads through the foundation of a fallen timber, slow, unseen, and utterly inevitable. In the beginning, the people of the Hawk's Trail had looked at her with a mixture of revulsion and awe, as if she were a piece of strange glowing driftwood spat up by a hostile sea. But as the march south ground on, the brutal reality of their world began to strip away the luxury of superstition. At first, they came to her at night, moving like shadows between the flickering watchfires. A woman named Leah came first, her palm split open from the jagged edge of a tanning vat, the wound already weeping a foul, yellowish bile. Then came a young scout with a festering thorn wound in his ankle, the limbs swollen and hot, the skin stretched so tight it looked ready to burst. Finally, the cooks and the laborers began to filter in, men coughing thick, dark blood into the dirt, ashamed of their weakness and terrified of being left behind by the army's relentless pace. They came hesitant, eyes downcast, whispering the word wit like it might summon a demon if spoken with too much breath. Amber never sent them away. She worked by firelight and instinct, her modern medical mind constantly translating the primitive tools at her disposal into life-saving interventions. She used pressure when they expected the chanting of a shaman. She used the patience of a surgeon when they expected the sharp sting of a brand. She became a creature of the dark hours, her hands constantly stained with the copper of blood and the green of crushed herbs. And she spoke. God, how she struggled to speak. At first, the language was a jagged mountain range her tongue couldn't climb. The percussive, throat-clearing consonants felt like stones in her mouth. Her accent bent the words into soft, rounded shapes that earned her mockery from the soldiers and confused stares from the women. But she was a doctor. She was used to learning complex systems. She spoke until the words began to fit, until her mouth learned the hard, flat resting place of their vowels. Her, she would say, her fingers pressing gently into a torn muscle. Wound. Hot, she whispered, her palm resting against a clammy forehead to gauge the bloom of a fever. Santa, she commanded, firm and unyielding, when a panicked boy tried to pull his leg away from her bone needle. Stop. Slowly, the camp began to answer her. They corrected her with quiet begrudging amusement when she accidentally called a bowl of stew a severed head or a broken wheel. They taught her the vital fragments of their world, without realizing they were handing her the keys to her own survival. Brex meant bone. Sil meant the loss of lifeblood. Tor meant the fuel of food. Len meant the sanctuary of sleep. By the time the sun rose each morning, Amber was a hollowed-out husk of a woman. Her copper hair was braided back so tightly it made her scalp ache, and her patched deerskin and scrub clothing was stiff with the salt of her own sweat. But as she walked through the lower sectors toward her own small tent, she heard it. Amber, not Wit, not the foreigner. They were using her name. It was a small victory, but in a world that wanted to erase her, it felt like a revolution. The warriors noticed. They stood at the edges of her makeshift infirmary, bronze-skinned men with dark hair and arms, mapped in white scar tissue. They watched her with narrowed, assessing eyes. They saw men who had faced mountain cats and obsidian blades without flinching, go perfectly still under the touch of her small, pale hands. She fixes, one of them, a scout named Val, murmured one night as he watched her reset a shoulder. No, a veteran replied, his voice a low rasp. She listens. The wit hears the body scream before it leaves the throat. It was 3 days after that quiet observation when the beast came. The scream that tore through the camp just after dawn was not a human sound. It was a sound born of prehistoric fury, a deep, tectonic roar that vibrated through the soles of Amber's feet and rattled the wooden posts of the tents. Amber was already on her feet before the horn sounded, her heart lurching into her throat. She stepped out into the biting morning air, just as the camp erupted. Warriors poured past her toward the north perimeter, their black and silver armor catching the first rays of a cold sun. She caught fragments of the shouting now. The language was finally starting to stick, even in the heat of a crisis. Beast! Claws at the gate! North fence has fallen. She followed at a distance, her pulse hammering like a drum. The smell hit her first. The thick, cloying stench of musk and old gore carried on a sharp wind. The creature was a nightmare. It was a mountain stalker, a massive feline-like predator, with a hide the color of wet slate and paws the size of shields. It had torn through the outer stores, its claws shredding timber and meat alike. Now it was a blur of matted fur and bared teeth, lashing out at the circle of spears that tried to hem it in. Then, Amber saw Dex fall. It happened with the sickening speed of a car crash. One moment, Dex, the conqueror's right hand, a man built like a statue of corded bronze, was shouting commands. His presence was the anchor for the entire line of defense. The next, the beast's claw caught him across the flank. The sound was visceral, the screech of metal being peeled back, the wet rip of leather and skin. He hit the muddy earth hard, his dark hair spraying across the dirt. Dex! Someone bellowed. The conqueror's blood! The beast was eventually driven off, bristling with arrows and spears, disappearing into the silverwood forest with a final, echoing roar. But as the dust settled, the victory felt like a funeral. They carried Dex back to the inner pavilion, the high-ranking sector of the camp where Amber was forbidden to go. But she didn't wait for an invitation. She ran. By the time she reached the pavilion, the official healers were already there, 3 older men with long, braided beards and hands slick with blood. They were murmuring prayers and casting small charred bones into a bowl of water. They had cut away Dex's armor, revealing a wound that made Amber's breath catch. She stood at the edge of the tent, ignored by the chaos. She saw it instantly with her clinical eyes. The wound wasn't just deep, it was a jagged, macerated tear. The muscle of his abdomen was shredded like old rags. The bleeding was slow, which was worse. It meant the hemorrhage was internal, pooling in places where these men couldn't see. Infection would claim him within 48 hours. The healers were doing nothing but whispering to ghosts. One of the old men stepped back, shaking his head. "Still too deep," he muttered, his voice funereal. "Bricks may be broken," another added. "No, Santa. No stopping it." They were giving up. "No!" The voice cracked through the pavilion like a whip. It was Ren, Dex's younger brother. He was a mirror image of Dex, but leaner, his face a mask of barely contained violence. He stood over the pallet, his knuckles white as he gripped the hilt of his sword. "Try again. Call the gods. Do something." The healers lowered their heads, refusing to meet his burning gaze. That was when a small voice rose from the back of the tent. "Amber." It was Ina, the woman Amber had saved on the first night. She was standing among the servants, her eyes wide. "The wit." "Amber." She stops the sill. Every head in the pavilion turned. Ren's eyes landed on Amber like two obsidian blades. The silence was absolute, save for the wet, labored breathing of the dying man on the floor. "She is wit," one of the healers spat, his voice trembling with indignation. "She is not of our blood. She uses the hands of a demon. She saved the boy with the thorn," someone whispered from the doorway. She closed the scout's shoulder. Ren turned fully toward her now. He looked at her pale, freckled skin, her vivid red hair, and her strange patched clothes. He saw the way she didn't flinch. "No," Ren said flatly. "She is foreign. She does not know the bronze blood. She will poison him." Amber stepped forward. She didn't think about the swords or the witch label. She only saw a patient whose clock was ticking. "I can try," she said. Her voice was steady, despite the tremor in her knees. She used their language, her accent thick but her grammar precise. Ren froze. He hadn't known she could speak. Dex groaned on the pallet, a thin line of pink froth appearing at the corner of his mouth. A lung was nicked. Amber met Ren's gaze. "If I do nothing," she said, her voice dropping into a low, clinical tone, "he dies before the moon rises. If I try, he might see the sun." The tension in the room was a physical weight. Ren looked at his brother, the man who was the heart of their army, and then back at the strange woman in the blue and fur rags. "One mistake," Ren whispered, his voice vibrating with a terrifying promise. "One slip of your hand, and I will feed your heart to the mountain cats myself." Amber didn't blink. "Santa," she said. "Stop." She moved to Dex's side. Up close, the man was a titan. Even laid low by a beast, he radiated a raw, magnetic power. His skin was burning. A septic fever was already beginning its assault. Amber ignored the blood and the crowd of warriors hovering over her. She forgot she was a prisoner. She forgot she was in another world. "What?" she commanded, pointing to the fire. "Boiled, now. And clean cloth." Someone, spurred by the authority in her voice, ran to obey. She worked for hours. She used a needle fashioned from a bird's wing bone and silk thread she had scavenged from a discarded banner. She cleaned the ragged edges of the wound with a stinging wash of fermented berry juice. She stitched the deep muscle layers first, her fingers dancing with a precision these people had never seen. Dex stirred, a guttural sound of agony tearing from his chest. "Santa," she murmured, her voice falling into the bedside manner she had used for a decade. She instinctively reached up and brushed a damp lock of dark hair away from his sweating brow. "Stay with me, Dex. Just stay." His eyes suddenly flew open. They weren't glazed with death. They were dark, piercing, and startlingly lucid. He looked up at her, his vision clearing, and his gaze locked onto hers. For a moment, the sounds of the camp, the crackle of the fire, the murmurs of the men, faded into a dull hum. Confusion flashed in his eyes, followed by a sharp, predatory curiosity. He looked at her red hair, then down at her hands, which were buried in his side, saving his life. He tried to speak, his throat clicking. "Santa," she whispered again, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw in a soothing gesture she didn't even realize she was making. And, impossibly, he went still. He watched her work, his eyes never leaving her face, until the sheer exhaustion of the trauma dragged him back into unconsciousness. When Amber finally pulled the last knot tight, her hands were shaking so violently she had to hide them in the folds of her fur vest. She was covered in him, his blood, his sweat, his life. The pavilion was silent. The healers had retreated into the shadows. Amber stood up slowly, her back popping. "He must rest," she told Ren, her voice cracking. "No move. Keep clean. If the hot returns, call me." Ren stared at his brother, then at the neat, terrifyingly perfect row of stitches. He looked at Amber with an expression that wasn't quite gratitude, but was something far more dangerous. Recognition of her power. "You will not return to the lower camp," Ren said. It was a decree. "You will stay here. You will watch him. If he stops breathing, you stop breathing." Amber nodded, too tired to argue, too tired to care. She sank down onto the dirt floor beside Dex's pallet as the warriors filed out, leaving her alone in the flickering golden light of the pavilion. As she watched the slow, steady rise and fall of the conqueror's chest, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air settled in her bones. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. She was no longer just the wit in the shadows. She was the woman who held the life of the hawk in her hands, and in this world, that didn't make her a doctor. It made her a prize. Chapter 4. The Man Who Would Not Die. Dex did not wake. Not fully. He drifted in and out of consciousness like a tide caught between moon and shore, his body burning beneath Amber's hands. She stayed beside him long after the pavilion emptied, long after the camp quieted into an uneasy, watchful sleep. The air inside the tent was thick, a heavy, cloying mixture of metallic blood, wood smoke, and the sharp, medicinal sting of the herbs she had crushed. The heat in the pavilion was oppressive, driven by the brazier at the foot of the bed and the radiating fever of the giant man before her. Amber stripped off her outer tunic, remaining in a thin, sweat-dampened shift that clung to her skin. She didn't care who saw. Her world had narrowed to the radius of the pallet and the rhythmic, labored expansion of Dex's ribs. Every so often, he would stir, his brow would furrow, a low groan vibrating in his throat that sounded less like a man in pain and more like a wounded predator. Each time, Amber was there. She would press a cool, damp cloth to his forehead, her fingers lingering against his temple. "Santa," she would murmur, using the local word for stay or still. "You're here. You're safe." She wasn't sure he understood, but he understood the touch. When her hand rested on his shoulder to keep him from thrashing, he seemed to lean into the contact, his muscles jumping under her palm like live wires. He was made of iron and bronze, a map of old scars and new violence. Touching him felt like touching a furnace, dangerous, yet in the chilling isolation of the camp, strangely grounding. At some point in the deep night, Ren returned. He didn't announce himself. He simply materialized at the edge of the firelight. Amber felt the prickle between her shoulders before she saw him. She didn't turn. She was busy squeezing water into Dex's parched lips. "You have not slept," Ren said. His voice was a low rasp that didn't stir the shadows. "I will," she replied, her accent softening the words but not weakening them. Later, Ren crouched beside his brother. His presence changed the air, adding a layer of sharp, predatory alertness. He scanned the wound, the meticulous bone needle stitching, and the way the swelling had begun to subside. "He breathes," Ren said quietly. It wasn't a comment. It was an observation of a miracle he hadn't expected. Yes, he did not, earlier. Amber finally looked at him. Her red hair had escaped its braid, falling in coppery, sweat-slicked curls around her face. Her eyes were shadowed, dark with a mix of exhaustion and adrenaline. "He's strong," she said, "but strength doesn't stop the rot. Only care does." Ren studied her. The blood smudged on her collarbone, the defiant set of her jaw. "You risked much," he said, "to save the man who burned your village. I'm a healer, Ren. I don't choose who deserves to live based on their sins. If I did, the world would be empty." Ren straightened, his hand resting habitually on the hilt of his sword. "If he dies," he said, the threat hanging heavy and cold, "there will be consequences for everyone who shares your blood." Amber didn't flinch. She looked back down at Dex, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "I know," she said simply. The fever spiked again just before dawn. Dex began to thrash, his massive frame shaking the pallet. Amber threw herself across his chest to pin him, her skin slick against his as she fought to keep him from tearing the stitches. "Dex! Look at me!" she hissed. His eyes snapped open. They were bloodshot, swimming with delirium, but they locked onto hers with terrifying intensity. He reached up, his hand, large enough to crush her skull, clamping onto the back of her neck. He pulled her down until their faces were inches apart. His breath was hot, smelling of iron and wine. "Fire!" he rasped, his gaze fixed on her hair. "The woods are burning." "No," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "It's just me. It's Amber." He stared at her, his analytical mind fighting through the fog of trauma. His hand softened on her neck, his thumb sliding over the sensitive skin behind her ear. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her that had nothing to do with fear. It was a raw, primal pull, the connection between the savior and the saved. "Amber," he repeated. The way he broke the syllables felt like a caress. He slumped back, the tension leaving his body as the fever finally broke in a rush of sweat. Amber stayed draped over him for a long moment, her forehead resting against his collarbone, listening to his heart settle into a slow, steady thrum. The intimacy of the moment was suffocating. She was a captive, a trophy of war, yet here she was, cradling the great conqueror like a lover in the ruins of his own ambition. Over the next 3 days, the camp transformed. The whispers changed. Amber was no longer the red witch to be feared. She was the woman who had pulled the hawk back from the veil. Food appeared outside the pavilion, roasted meats, sweet fruits, and flagons of watered wine. On the third morning, Dex woke with full clarity. Amber was sitting on a low stool, mending a tear in her tunic. The sunlight filtered through the heavy canvas of the tent, casting a golden glow over the scene. "You are still here," Dex said. His voice was stronger, the command returning to it. Amber looked up, startled. "I'm a prisoner. Where would I go?" Dex pushed himself up onto his elbows. The furs fell away, revealing the heavy bandaging across his bronze torso. He looked at her, his dark eyes tracing the line of her throat, the curve of her shoulders. There was no coldness in his gaze now, only a deep, predatory curiosity. "You could have let me fade," he said. Ren would have been angry, but he would have spared you eventually. "You chose the harder path." "I chose the only path I know," she said, standing and walking toward him to check his bandage. As she leaned over him, the scent of her soap, herbs, and warm skin filled his senses. Dex reached out, not with the violence of the night before, but with a slow, deliberate movement. He took her hand, his fingers tracing the calluses on her palms. "These are not the hands of a village girl," he murmured. "I told you. I've seen many things, many worlds." He pulled her hand toward his chest, pressing her palm directly over his heart. It beat strong and fast beneath her touch. "Tell me about your world, Amber. Tell me what could produce a woman who stares down a conqueror without blinking." "It's a world of light and noise," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "And it's gone. I'm here now." Dex's grip tightened, tugging her closer until she had to brace herself against his shoulder. The heat radiating from him was no longer the heat of illness. It was the vital, pulsing warmth of a man very much alive and acutely aware of the woman in his personal space. "Then you belong to this world now," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous velvet. "You belong to me." Amber should have been repulsed. She should have pulled away. But as she looked into his dark, intelligent eyes, she felt a terrifying surge of desire. It was the Florence Nightingale effect, twisted into something darker, forged in blood and fire. "I belong to no one," she whispered, though she didn't move her hand. Dex smiled, a slow, devastating tilt of his lips. "We shall see, little healer. We shall see." The tension in the room was a physical weight, a tether pulling them toward a collision that neither was ready for, yet both sensed was inevitable. Amber realized then that she hadn't just saved a man, she had invited a storm into her soul. And as the sun climbed higher over the mountain pass, she knew the march to the tent city would no longer be a journey of a captive, but the beginning of a siege of a different kind. Chapter 5. Fire that does not burn. Dex healed in increments so small, Amber barely trusted them. She measured his recovery the way she measured everything, by breath count, by the steadiness of his pulse beneath her fingers, by the color returning to his skin. Strength, to her, wasn't how quickly he stood or how fiercely he commanded. It was how quietly his body complied with her care. The arrangement became unavoidable. Dex's pavilion was no longer just a medical ward. It was the center of the camp's gravity. "You stay," Ren said on the fourth morning, his massive arms crossed over his chest, his expression carved from the same stone as the mountains surrounding them. "Until he walks without pain." Amber didn't argue. Dex's pavilion had become her prison and her shield, all at once. 2 guards stood watch at the entrance now, not to keep her from leaving, but to keep the restless, superstitious soldiers from disturbing the red wit at her work. Forced proximity wasn't announced. It simply saturated the air. She slept on furs near his pallet, the scent of him, cedar, old leather, and the iron tang of healing, filling her lungs until she forgot what the open air smelled like. She ate when he ate, often sharing the same bowl of salted broth or roasted grain. "You hover," Dex remarked one evening, his voice a dry rasp that vibrated in the small space. Amber didn't look up from the poultice she was grinding, the stone pestle thudding rhythmically. "You complain," she replied. "We're even." He huffed a quiet laugh. It was a low, rusty sound that startled the guards outside. It startled Amber too. It was the first sign of the man beneath the conqueror, a man who found amusement in the defiance of a woman who should have been trembling at his feet. Their banter sharpened with familiarity, a dangerous game of verbal chess played in the flickering firelight. You'll tear the stitches if you keep reaching for that map, she scolded, slapping his hand away from a heavy vellum scroll. I am not fragile, Amber. You were bleeding out 3 days ago. Your definition of fragile is skewed by ego. A temporary inconvenience, he countered, his dark eyes locking onto hers. A man who fears a needle is not fit to lead an empire. She glanced at him, her gaze lingering on the hollow of his throat. You nearly died, Dex. Most men would be humbled. You just seem annoyed by the delay. His gaze met hers, unflinching and intensely curious. And yet, I did not die. Because of you, she rolled her eyes, turning back to her bandages to hide the flush creeping up her neck. Men like you are the reason doctors back home developed a taste for whiskey. What is whiskey? He asked mildly. She smiled despite herself, a genuine, bittersweet curve of her lips. Never mind. It's a medicine for the healer, not the patient. He watched her constantly. It wasn't the way the men in her village had watched her, with suspicion or hunger or the fear of a curse. It was quieter. Calculating, as if she were a puzzle he enjoyed not solving too quickly. He watched the way she tied her hair back, the way she moved with a clinical efficiency that ignored his status, and the way her eyes clouded with memories of a place he couldn't imagine. You think, he said once, when she paused mid-task, staring into the embers of the brazier. Yes, she replied. It's a habit. What of? She hesitated. Hospitals. Electricity. The sound of a car engine. The smell of rain on asphalt. None of it would make sense to him. Home, she said finally. He nodded slowly. You are here now. In this world, home is a luxury for those who stop fighting. I have never had one. That explains a lot, she muttered, though her heart ached with a sudden sharp sympathy she didn't want to feel. When Dex was finally strong enough to sit outside the pavilion, the camp reacted like a tide pulling back before a storm. Soldiers paused mid-task, the ring of hammers on anvils dying out. Men who had whispered of omens now stared openly. He lives, someone muttered, a prayer and a curse all at once. Wit magic, another breathed, clutching a protective amulet. Amber caught the word easily now. Wit. Witch. It clung to her like smoke. She hated it, the superstition, the lack of logic. And yet, she used it. She kept her chin high, her expressions unreadable, letting the mystery of her skills serve as a barrier. Fear, she had learned, was the only currency these people traded in, besides blood. Her responsibilities expanded rapidly. Ren brought her supplies without comment. Clean cloth, sharpened blades, even a potent distilled grain spirit strong enough to sterilize tools. The camp's traditional healers, men who used chanting and dirt-caked poultices, were ordered to watch her work. They watched with stiff backs, horrified and awed. She boils the water, one whispered to another, as if she were performing an alchemy of the gods. She washes her hands until they are raw, another noted, his voice trembling. As if the air itself is poisoned, Amber didn't soften it for them. She corrected their technique harshly, demanding cleanliness where they offered ritual. She was carving a space for science in a world of myth, and she did it with a lethal precision that earned her a new kind of title, the Hawk's Shadow. At night, when exhaustion finally dragged her under, Amber dreamed of the life she'd lost. She dreamed of the trauma bay, the beep of the vitals monitor, the bright, sterile white of the tiles, the smell of antiseptic. She woke each time in the dark, the heavy furs weighing her down with the same thought clawing at her ribs. If I died in that crash, heaven wouldn't be this brutal. This has to be something else. She began to test the reality of her surroundings. She tracked the patterns of the stars, noting they didn't match any constellation she knew. She examined the plant structures, finding subtle inconsistencies in the cellular layout of the leaves. Even the anatomy of the men was slightly different. Stronger bone density, a higher tolerance for shock. She kept notes scratched into scraps of bark with a charred stick, hiding them beneath her palette. Dex noticed. He noticed everything. You plan, he said one evening, his voice cutting through the silence as she huddled over her bark scraps. I think, she corrected, not looking up. You plan to leave. Her hand stilled, the charred stick snapped in her fingers. Yes, he accepted that without a surge of anger. You will fail. She looked up then, her eyes bright with defiance. You don't know that. You don't even know where I'm from. No, he agreed, leaning back against his cushions, the firelight catching the gold of his eyes. But I know this land. It devours those who do not belong to it. And I know you, Amber. You are a healer. You cannot leave a wound half closed. And I am your greatest wound. The words struck deeper than she expected, a chilling realization of how well he had read her. The tension between them broke on the 10th night. She was checking his side, her fingers deft and familiar, as she palpated the area around the scar. The wound was closed, the skin pink and healthy, Dex was sitting up, his chest bare, his breathing shallow as she moved closer. The air in the tent felt hyper-oxygenated, electric. "It's healed," she whispered, her hand lingering just a second too long on his ribcage. Dex reached up, his hand closing around her wrist. His skin was hot, a deep, vital heat that seemed to seep into her bones. He didn't pull her away, and he didn't let her go. "Amber," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous velvet. "You should rest," she said, her voice trembling. "I have rested enough." He pulled her closer, his gaze dropping to her lips. She should have fought. She should have remembered the village, the fire, the conquest. But in the dim light, he wasn't a conqueror. He was a man who had looked into the abyss and come back, and she was the one who had held the light. The kiss was sudden, exploratory, and heavy, with a desperate, primal hunger. It tasted of iron and salt, and the terrifying thrill of the unknown. When they parted, both were breathing as if they had run a mile. "We should not," he murmured, his forehead resting against hers. "I know," she whispered, but as she looked at him, Amber realized the most frightening truth of all. She hadn't just saved the man who wouldn't die. She had started a fire that she had no idea how to put out. Chapter 6. What the Rain Reveals. The camp did not stay still. It moved like a living thing, slow at first, then with gathering, relentless purpose. Amber noticed the change in rhythm before anyone explained it to her. Tents were struck at dawn instead of midday. Supply carts were reorganized with frantic precision. The outer perimeter tightened, the vanguard doubling along the flanks until the column stretched like a great iron serpent across the plains. Migration. She watched from the edge of Dex's pavilion, as the world around her packed itself into motion. The followers, the displaced, the desperate, the seekers, were herded into disciplined columns. Soldiers adjusted armor straps, sharpened blades, and checked the hooves of their massive, shaggy horses. The air hummed with a low-frequency anticipation that made the hair on her arm stand up. She approached Ren when she could no longer stand the silence of not knowing. "Where are we going?" she asked. Her accent was still present, a strange melodic lilt in their harsh tongue, but it had softened over the months. Ren glanced at her, then back at the horizon where the mountains met the sky like jagged teeth. "Home camp," he said. "The high seat. The large one." Her chest tightened. "With families?" Yes, the word echoed in her mind. Families. It was only then, as the march progressed, that she noticed the shift in the camp's demographic. Women were arriving in greater numbers, women with status, adorned in hammered bronze and dyed leather rather than the gray rags of the camp followers. Children trotted alongside carts, their laughter a surreal sound against the backdrop of clanking steel. These were not the spoils of war. These were the people Dex was building a world for. She also saw the concubines. The hierarchy was visible in posture alone. The wives walked with heads high, while others trailed behind, eyes downcast, a living testament to the polygamous brutality of this era. Her modern brain, trained in the egalitarian halls of a city hospital, recoiled instinctively. She felt like a biological anomaly dropped into a petri dish of ancient patriarchal history. The camp grew as the days passed, swelling into something closer to a moving city than a temporary war camp. Wooden structures rose where once there had been tents, disassembled and reassembled at every stop. Drainage channels were dug with intention. Smoke from thousands of cookfires hung thick and constant in the air, a gray shroud that never quite lifted. Then, the rainy season arrived without apology. Warm, relentless rain soaked the ground, turning the beaten earth paths into treacherous mires of mud. It seeped into bedding, dampened grain, and, most dangerously, into wounds. Amber recognized the danger immediately. In her world, rain was an inconvenience. Here, it was a biological weapon. Disease followed rain as surely as night followed day. She acted before the first fever could take hold. She didn't ask for permission. She took it. She ordered the latrine pits deepened and moved a mile downwind from the water sources. She demanded every drop of drinking water be boiled until it hissed. She set up hand-washing stations near the communal food preparation areas, using a gritty mixture of wood ash and water when soap was unavailable. There was resistance, sharp and jagged. "Wit ways," some muttered, splashing through the mud. "She tries to wash away the strength of the men." But the numbers didn't lie. Fewer people fell ill. The dysentery that usually gutted a marching army stayed at bay. Fewer fevers burned unchecked. Fewer wounds festered into the rot that claimed limbs. The result spoke louder than any superstition, and slowly, the grumbling turned into a wary, silent respect. Dex watched it all from his mount, a dark figure against the gray sky. He did not interfere. He did not issue a command to support her, but he did not stop her. He let her reshape his society in small, practical ways, and the camp began to thrive because of it. "You change us," he said one evening. The rain drummed a frantic rhythm against the heavy leather of the pavilion roof. "I'm preventing outbreaks," she replied, her fingers cramped from scratching notes into a fresh piece of bark. "There's a difference." "There is not," he said quietly, stepping closer. The smell of wet earth and leather clung to him. "To men like mine, the woman who stops the fever is more powerful than the man who leads the charge. You are changing the way they survive." She finally met his gaze. "Does that bother you? That I'm making them less sacrificial?" "No," he said, his eyes glowing like embers in the dim light. "It interests me. It makes them harder to kill, and I have many enemies who wish to kill them." Their relationship shifted during the march. Proximity had already forged a physical intimacy, but now there was something else layered atop it. Intent, Dex began walking beside her openly, leading his horse so he could match her pace. He began to consult her on matters that had nothing to do with medicine, logistics of the march, the morale of the wounded, the storage of winter supplies. It unsettled his commanders, especially Wren, who watched Amber with a growing, silent intensity. It unsettled Amber most of all. She was becoming a pillar of a society she still hoped to escape. One night, as thunder rolled low and heavy across the plains, Dex spoke the words that fractured her remaining certainty. "You will be my wife." She froze, a bandage roll slipping from her numb fingers. It wasn't the possessiveness that stopped her heart. It was the casual, absolute certainty in his voice, like he was stating a law of gravity. "I don't belong here, Dex," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You do," he replied, reaching out to tuck a damp strand of red hair behind her ear. "You just do not know it yet. You look for a door that does not exist, while standing in the house you have built." She shook her head, stepping back. "Your men, they have wives. Concubines. I've seen the way it works here. I've seen the columns of women." "Yes," he said. "I won't be one of many. I won't be a trophy in a tent." His eyes sharpened, the gold in them flashing. "You would be the only one." Her breath caught in her throat. "I have no wives," he continued, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "I have had no interest in the political alliances of daughters. I do not want them. I want the woman who looked at me while I was dying and told me to live." The simplicity of it undid her. He wasn't offering her a crown. He was offering her his singular focus. She did not accept him that night, but she did not refuse him either. They crossed a line quietly. It began with shared nights, sleeping side by side for warmth as the damp cold of the rains bit through the blankets. Then came the lingering touches, the way his hand found the small of her back. When they finally gave in to the pull between them, it was desperate and aching. It wasn't a conquest. It was a choice. Two lonely people in a brutal world finding a temporary sanctuary. Amber hated herself for how much she wanted him. She hated how easily the great conqueror softened for her, how he listened when she spoke of sanitation and science, how he never raised his voice to her even when she challenged his authority. She began to imagine a future. A life here. A home. And then, she saw him execute a man. It was public. Deliberate. A lesson carved in blood. A soldier had been caught stealing grain from the communal stores. Grain meant for the children and the elderly during the lean weeks of the march. The evidence was undeniable. The punishment, according to the law Dex had written, was absolute. Amber arrived at the center of the camp, just as the sentence was carried out. The rain turned the dirt to a dark, hungry red. The man begged. He sobbed, promising reform, mentioning a daughter. Dex listened without a flicker of emotion on his face. He looked like a statue of a god of war. He nodded once. The blade fell. The sound, the wet, heavy thud of steel meeting bone, lodged itself in Amber's soul. She stumbled back, the smell of copper and rain filling her lungs. She turned and ran, bile burning her throat. That night, she couldn't look at him. When he entered the pavilion, she stayed huddled in the corner. "You judge me," Dex said eventually, standing by the fire. "I can't." Her voice broke. "You didn't even hesitate. He was one of yours." "No," Dex said firmly. "He was a parasite. If I let one man steal the life of the collective, I have failed the thousands who follow me. If I hesitate, the camp falls to chaos." "People can change, Dex. They can be taught. So can empires," he replied, looking at his hands as if he could see the blood on them. "But not through mercy alone. Mercy without strength is just a slow death." She saw him then, truly saw him. He wasn't just the man who held her at night. He was the monster who had burned villages to build a nation. The fracture in her heart split wide. She lay awake as the rain battered the earth, wondering if she was the one being changed. Because a small, dark part of her understood his logic, and that frightened her more than the blade. She still looked at the stars when the clouds parted, searching for a way home. But the urgency had dulled. replaced by the weight of the people who now looked to her to keep them alive. As the camp flourished under her care, Amber wondered if she was healing a world or losing herself to it. And Dex, watching her from the shadows, knew the greatest battle, the one for her soul, had only just begun. Chapter 7. The door that stayed closed. The high seat rose from the plains like something alive. Amber saw it from a ridge at dawn, the mist still clinging low to the earth, blurring the lines between the grass and the sky. What she had thought would be a mere camp, even a large one, was a city. It was a sprawling fortress of timber walls reinforced with gray stone, watchtowers bristling with black banners, and smoke rising in steady, purposeful columns that looked like pillars holding up the heavens. It was not temporary. It was permanence carved into a hostile world. This was Dex's heartland. This was the foundation of an empire. The march slowed as they approached the towering gates. Horns did not blare this time. There was no need for the aggressive call of war. Instead, the drums rolled, deep, resonant, and ceremonial. The soldiers straightened their spines, the armor clinking in a rhythmic symphony. The followers fell into a respectful silence. Women stepped forward from the city gates with children wrapped in clean, thick furs, their faces painted not with the soot of war, but with the white clay of welcome. Amber felt it then, deep in her chest. This was not a conquest. This was a homecoming. As the heavy timber gates groaned open, the people inside surged forward. They didn't move in panic or desperation, but in reverence. They shouted Dex's name, a roar that vibrated in Amber's very marrow. They struck spears against shields in a deafening salute. They bowed their heads as he passed, his massive frame, 6 feet 5 inches, casting a long shadow over his people. And then, unexpectedly, they turned their gaze toward her. It wasn't a sudden, loud roar. It was a steady, creeping awareness that rippled through the crowd. Hands touched chests and dipped in acknowledgement. Mothers pulled their children closer, whispering as they pointed at the woman in the strange blue scrubs and the dark cloak. Elderly men, scarred by decades of survival, inclined their heads as she passed. Wit, they breathed. But the word had shifted. It no longer carried the sharp, jagged edge of a curse. It had been smoothed by rumor and proven by the living. Now, it meant something else. The one who keeps us alive. Amber swallowed hard, her hand instinctively gripping the strap of her medical bag. The city smelled different from the war camps. It lacked the cloying, sweet rot of untreated infection and the sour stench of stagnant waste. As they moved through the streets, she noticed her influence had arrived long before she did. There were drainage channels cut deep into the earth. Waste pits were placed strictly downwind and far from the wells. Even the market seemed organized with a burgeoning sense of hygiene. They had remembered her lessons. They had practiced them in her absence. Her days filled quickly. Dex did not sequester her in a palace. He knew her better than that. She was given a permanent structure near the central square, a longhouse of stone and cedar converted into a massive healing hall. It had stone basins for washing, dedicated fires for boiling water, and storage shelves already stocked with dried herbs and clean linen. The local healers, the shamans and bone setters who had practiced for generations, were ordered to attend her. Not to be replaced, but to learn. At first they watched her with narrowed eyes, suspicion clinging to them like damp wool. They saw her as a threat to their ancient prestige. Then, they watched her work. They saw her insist on scrubbing hands until the skin was red. They saw her isolate the coughing children before the fever could sweep the city. They saw her use the wit smoke, the steam from boiling pots, to clean her tools. They saw children survive winters that had once thinned their numbers by half. The results were undeniable. One by one, the healers laid down their pride. They didn't just learn her methods. They began to treat her as a living deity of health. But even as she built this world, the ghost of her old life haunted her. The head shaman, a man named Ilian, arrived on the 7th day. He was old, but not aged like the others. His skin was pale and weathered, and his hair was iron gray, braided with strange tokens, bits of stainless steel and shards of clear glass that looked like they belonged in a laboratory, not a primitive fort. He watched her from the shadows of the hall as she set a boy's broken arm. He didn't look at her with awe, he looked at her with recognition. That night, he came to her hall alone. "I know your steps," he said. His speech was strange, too precise, as if he were translating from a language that required more logic than the local tongue. "They are not from this land." Amber's heart slammed against her ribs. "You speak differently." "So do you," he replied gently. "Even after all this time, your soul still vibrates at a different frequency." She stared at him, hope and terror warring in her chest. "Who are you?" "A man who walked through a tear in the world once," he said, "and lived long enough to forget the sound of a television." The word hit her like a physical blow. "Television. You're from my world," she whispered, tears springing to her eyes. I was. 40 years ago. I was a structural engineer, he said with a faint, sad smile. Now, I am a man who reads the entrails of goats to keep the peace. But I know the door, Amber. He told her of a place where the fabric of reality was thin, a high ridge to the east where lightning struck the iron-veined stone during the peak of the rains. You can return, he said. The door opens only when the sky splits. It is a one-way path. You go, and the door seals forever. The weight of the choice crushed the air from her lungs. She thought of hot showers. She thought of her sister. She thought of a world where she wasn't constantly fighting against the Dark Ages. And then, she thought of Dex. That night, Amber walked the inner walls. The rain had stopped, leaving the air crisp and smelling of pine. She looked out over the city, over the fires burning clean, over the people sleeping without the shadow of the plague, over a world she had reshaped with her own 2 hands. Dex found her there, as he always did. He stood 6 feet 5 inches, a mountain of a man whose presence usually demanded the room, but with her, he was always still. The healing scar on his face was a pale line in the moonlight. You know, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, you will leave, he said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual command. I could, she said, turning to him. The silence between them stretched, heavy with everything they hadn't said. Would you? He asked finally. If I go, she said, her voice trembling, I can never come back. I leave this world behind. I leave the hospitals I built. I leave the people I saved. I leave you. His jaw tightened, the muscles corded like iron. Then stay. Don't be a memory, Amber. Be a queen. I saw what you did at the execution, Dex, she said quietly. I still don't agree with the blood. I still don't agree with the way you hold power. I would do it again, he said, stepping closer until he towered over her. Because I must. To keep this peace you have built, I am the sword that protects your shield. I know, she whispered. She reached up, her small hand, 5 feet 5 inches, resting against his scarred cheek. And the terrible thing is, I still love you. Something in his expression broke, not loudly, but like a dam finally giving way under the weight of a river. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. Lightning split the sky 2 nights later. The air felt electric, smelling of metal and salt. Amber stood at the high ridge at dawn, the shaman waiting silently behind her. A swirling vortex of light, blue and violent, tore at the air above the iron-veined rocks. It was her way out. It was a ride home. She looked into the light and saw her old life. The sterile white halls, the hum of machines, the safety of a world that didn't need her to be a miracle worker. Then she looked back at the city in the valley. She saw the smoke from her healing hall. She saw the people who had stopped calling her a witch and started calling her a savior. She saw Dex, standing at the base of the ridge, refusing to come closer, giving her the choice he had once denied her. She saw herself, not as a displaced doctor, but as a woman who had found a purpose greater than herself. I won't go, she said, her voice steady against the howling wind. The shaman bowed his head. Then the door will close, and you will grow old in a world that will never fully understand you. They don't have to understand me, Amber said, turning away from the light. They just have to live. The light vanished with a thunderclap that shook the mountains. When she descended the ridge, Dex was waiting. He didn't speak. He didn't ask for explanations. He simply pulled her into a crushing embrace, anchoring her to the earth, to the mud, and to him. The high seat changed after that. They built bathhouses. They created a code of laws that valued life as much as loyalty. Amber was no longer the wit. She was the great healer, the woman who had walked away from the stars to save the earth. She was never entirely at peace. She still missed the taste of coffee and the sound of a car engine. But when the rains came again, and the graves remained empty, she knew she had chosen the right world. She wasn't just a doctor anymore. She was the mother of an empire. If you enjoyed this journey through time and the brutal heart of the high seat, don't let the story end here. Subscribe to the channel, like this video if you think Amber made the right choice, or tell us in the comments if you would have stepped through that door. Join our community. Your support keeps these stories alive. Until next time, keep seeking the light in the dark.